Hello, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hey, it's a wonderful Wednesday. The weather is great. The room is full with wonderful people. They've just served you a great lunch. And we're going to have a great topic today: brain health and memory loss. And we are honored to have Kaye McGrath from UW Health Memory Clinic, which is located right here in Fitchburg, with us today. Right here in Fitchburg, right down the street here. So I would like for you all to show her some love and give her a warm welcome. Welcome, Kaye.
Well, thank you, Janice, for reaching out and having me, and also to all of you for being here as well. I'm slightly vertically challenged, so I will just adjust here. So I know you're all eating lunch, and yes, I'm glad that we could give you a few minutes to get settled in for sure. This is kind of a large topic and one that I enjoy. I do work for the University of Wisconsin Medical Foundation, and currently am doing memory clinic work every day. So these are things that are kind of near and dear to my heart as well as my brain. So again, we're talking about brain health and memory. I know that there generally tends to be a lot of questions and comments maybe about these things, which I love. If I'm doing my job right, hopefully there are questions and there is discussion. And I learn just as much from you guys as you learn from me, and so I really welcome that. The other piece, though, is I always tell people is if it's something that you feel like can wait to the end, I do try to build in a fair amount of time to my talks at the end, so that way we can have discussion, because sometimes one question begets another question. Sometimes those happen better organically. But if you feel like it's something that you really need to answer or ask right now because you might forget it, I'm fine with that too, because I have those days as well. But certainly, just feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you. The other piece is there is a fair amount of information. I do try to go through it fairly quickly, but at the same time, again, want to make sure that we're getting the basics as well. So again, hopefully this is beneficial for you guys. It's of interest to me. All right, can everybody hear me okay? That's the first thing. Okay, got it on stop. Okay, so we're gonna move on, and I just learned how to drive the clicker, so. All right, so our first thing is, what is our brain? I gave this, presented this talk to my parents once upon a time, and my mother said, "Great talk, Kaye, but what is a brain?" So I threw this slide in here for her. Basics. She's a teacher, so again, she said, well, we need some background. So here we are. There was a journal article in the BMJ, which is the British Medical Journal, back in 2020 with Dr. Wang et al., who I thought stated it very eloquently, and they pack a lot in a short statement, where the human brain is the command center for the nervous system and enables thoughts, memory, movement, and emotions by a complex function that's the highest product of biological evolution. Well, that's a mouthful. But really what it means is the brain does so much. And really, it's one of the most complex organs in our system, and it's probably still the most mysterious organ in our system. There's so much we still have to learn about the brain and that we don't know. So with that in mind, obviously, no pun intended, is that the brain has three main functions that we like to think about that actually affect all aspects of our daily lives. So everything we're doing day to day is impacted by our brain. This includes interpretation of senses. So again, what we see, taste, smell, hear, the lunch before you, the people sitting next to you, the breeze on your face, right? Our brain is interpreting these things, and it also controls movement. Our brain maintains cognitive, mental, and emotional processes. So how we interact with others, the emotions that we get out of that, emotional responses to music, those things are all run by the brain. And then, of course, maintains normal behavior and social cognition. So how do we interact with people in a social world, etiquette, again, how we interpret behavior over time. Again, some of these things can certainly be influenced by where we come from, our cultures, and some of those experiences that we have across our lifespan. So moving on, the human brain anatomy. So this just kind of goes into a little bit more depth of what does the brain do. So as you can see, I tried to color code a little bit just because, again, I like colors and visuals are fun. So the idea, of course, is that each area of the brain is responsible for certain functions. Generally, those areas of the brain need to work together in order to be as successful as can be when you're doing things day to day. As you can see, if you have an issue in something like the frontal lobe, that could still potentially affect how things work in the other lobes. So again, it really is a bunch of teamwork that happens in the brain as well. And again, just kind of speaks to the complexity of the things that your brain is doing. But that also we have to think about, if something is going wrong in our brain, how do we backtrack? How do we find out where that might be arising from? So this can be beneficial, especially when we get to some of those other slides a little later. What is brain health? So we know what the brain is now, but what do we mean by brain health? And I think that's a really good question because it depends on who you ask. Right now, there isn't necessarily just one standard definition that everyone's utilizing when we talk about what we mean by brain health. I generally tend to go with the definition that's done from the World Health Organization, which is this one right here, that brain health is the state of brain functioning across cognitive, sensory, social, emotional, behavioral, and motor domains, and it allows a person to realize their full potential over the course of a lifespan. I think that's important because I think, we all define what our full potential is differently. So this also allows for that variability in our ability to be individuals over time. Again, obviously the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention kind of bring things down a little bit, maybe less specific as far as like the ability to perform all mental processes of cognition, including the ability to learn and judge, use language, and to remember things. And yet again, the American Heart Association and the American Stroke Association have their own definition where it really comes down to like performance at a normal level when compared with people across that same age demographic. Again, I certainly think, while they're all different, there's a common thread of that ideally brain health is where our brain is working to its optimum, that we can function to our optimum across our lifespan. So we'll move on here. The NIH, of course, simplified things even more, bless their hearts, for creating an infographic, or as my grandma would say, a picture that helps us learn these things too, like what is my brain doing, what's healthy about my brain. Again, the way that we function across several areas is a measure of how we're functioning cognitively as well. So again, you might be doing really well in thinking and learning and remembering, but maybe you have difficulty with movement or balance. There's different reasons those things can happen. And again, how we define our own health can be different person to person as well. So what determines brain health? So of course, when we're looking at how do we make recommendations as providers? How do we pare down information to synthesize it and give it to all of you and to what we can do to help and what creates brain health? The World Health Organization has come up with multiple areas, of course, that are going to impact our cognitive function. Obviously, some of those are listed here. So the big ones are physical health, environmental health, safety and security, lifelong learning, and social connection. The other one that was added, of course, is access to services, which is, again, something that not everybody has. So, of course, physical health encompasses a lot of things like genetics, infections, illnesses, injuries, nutrition. Environmental health are, again, things that we might be exposed to, chemicals, right? Air and water quality, so when we don't necessarily have access to safe air, water, those things are going to affect our mental health as well. And, of course, safe and healthy workplaces or places that we go to school. Safety and security also can speak to physical safety, so being in our own home, do we feel safe? Is there a history of abuse or things like that? And then financial security is another piece of this as well. Lifelong learning. So again, like you guys all fit in this category right here today, right? We're here, we're in a room together, we're continuing to challenge our brain and our mind by learning something new. So that's why places like community centers are so important, and places that I regularly rely on in order to help my patients function better. And access of the social connection, of course, is community centers. We had this little thing called the COVID pandemic a few years back, and that kind of put a wrench in things when it came down to social connection. And we certainly do see ramifications from that day to day now, even in my practice and certainly in family medicine. And it really impacts how people are doing and quality of life overall. Once we lose some of those skills, it can be hard to get them back. So keeping ourselves connected across our lifespan is really important too. There are a lot of folks that had a hard time reconnecting after that social isolation. And again, many things can affect brain health across the lifespan, as we've pointed out, and influences how our brains develop and adapt across a lifetime. So I always tell people this isn't just now, right? I know we're talking about memory and thinking now because we're in this room and we're all together and kind of thinking about what would I do for my brain now. But I also tell people, like, these are things we have to think about across our lifespan. So from little on, as our brains are developing, having access to these things or optimizing our lives in these areas are going to lead to better outcomes when we're sitting in chairs here today, for example. Again, addressing these determinants have led to recommended strategies for promoting health of your brain and, of course, preventing decline over time. So as I said before, all these organizations look at these pieces and they say, how can we help? How can we give recommendations that people can be empowered to create their own prevention and to make sure they're as healthy as possible? Which leads us to our next slide, which is the 6 pillars of brain health. So these are 6 areas that I talk about every day in my clinic with my patients over and over probably. That they may get sick of it, actually, but I think the best things sometimes are the most basic, and sometimes we have to bring ourselves back to those basic foundations to get the best or get the most out of our lives. So physical activity. I know your primary care providers have been telling you forever that it's good to exercise, right? I know, mine does too. Most days I get there, some days I don't, but 150 minutes of moderate exercise a week is beneficial to the health of blood vessels. Well, why do we care, right? Sure, yep, my provider told me if I exercise, my blood pressure will come down, my cholesterol will look better. Those things are all good, but I also tell people it also matters for your brain. So not only is your blood pressure going to benefit, but those vessels then in your brain's going to benefit as well. Not only do your blood vessels benefit, but then you also have better activity for your neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are a big deal in our brain because they have to do with so many processes, like our mood, how we process things, like our thinking speeds and rates, and again, how we regulate our emotions. So again, it's important that we have good activity in our neurotransmitters. And those are things like serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine. So we'll hear about those a little later too. So getting about 30 minutes, 5 days a week or so of exercise is wonderful. Again, I tell people this doesn't have to be running a marathon, right? It can be walking 10 minutes 3 times a day. That adds up to 30 minutes, right? It could be a floor pedaler. Maybe you have balance issues. You can put that on the floor and pedal like you're on a bike, but you're sitting in your reclining chair. Those things are still beneficial and, again, help with brain health, but also those other areas that, again, maybe your primary care provider has talked to you about as well. And then, of course, nutrition. So we're always talking about the Mediterranean diet and the MIND diet. I always say the MIND diet is really just a variation of the Mediterranean diet, whereby we're actually just trying to make sure that we're getting whole fruits, whole vegetables. And if we're doing things like proteins, it's things like chicken, fish, nuts, beans, legumes, things like that, trying to avoid that red meat if we can, and those highly processed foods. Highly processed foods, which are usually those convenience things or the things that I make at home when I'm just feeling like I don't want to do any work, are those things that can create oxidative stress on our cells. So that essentially means that we're creating cell damage. And cell damage can happen anywhere, including in our brain. So some of the biggest things I tell people is if you're gonna choose like just a couple things to focus on for good diet, because let's face it, we can't do everything. Rome wasn't built in a day, right? I say try to get berries and nuts in your diet. They're wonderful for your brain. Try to decrease that red meat. and limit things like cheese. I know, it's terrible, it's the dairy state, I know I said it. But instead of maybe having, your 5 pieces of cheese a day, having 1 piece, it's those moderation pieces. This is really important. And again, trying to get those fruits and vegetables. Sleep. Getting 8 to 9 hours of sleep. I don't know if any of you get 8 to 9 hours of sleep. I think it depends on what part of life we're in. It's an honorable goal, I tell people. But the other piece to this is we have to consider the quality of sleep at night too. So quantity and quality helps our brain do the best it can. Your brain doesn't shut off when you sleep. Your brain actually does a lot of work when you're sleeping. And the benefit of getting good sleep means that you're usually having more time in those deeper levels of sleep, like REM sleep. And what people often don't recognize is that if your REM sleep is shorter and shorter each night, that actually negatively impacts your short-term or working memory. So that short-term and working memory are those things we often see changes in first as we're aging and as our brain ages, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in order to make sure we're getting enough REM sleep, we have to be in sleep a sufficient amount of time. So if you don't get enough REM sleep, your short-term memory is not going to work as well. Your recall will not be as good. Health management. I love that they sum all of this up in one little line, really, is health management is, again, all the medical conditions that you might have, like leaving things unaddressed generally leads to faster mental decline over time. So these are the things, again, your primary care provider has probably been talking to you about, right? It's our cholesterol. It's our blood sugar control. It's our heart rate, maybe, things like diabetes, coming back to that exercise again, too. Those things that are helping us address the day-to-day is going to be important over time. And again, whether this starts in our 20s or our 50s, it's always good to start to address these things because, again, nothing happens in a vacuum, right? We may have something that progresses over time, like maybe we started out with a little blood pressure issue, went away, we ate better, we exercised, and now it's getting worse and worse. It's better to address those things as soon as we can. Social interaction, again, coming back to that social connection, it makes you interpret and respond to verbal and visual cues. I don't think many people think about that when we think about having a conversation with our next door neighbor or the friend at the table with us today. And sure, absolutely, if you have a partner at home, et cetera, and you guys are talking day to day, that's great. But there's a lot to be said for having to go out to meet somebody new or talk to somebody different. Is it gives kind of like a cross training for your brain, right? There's so many processes that go in to how we respond to people and how we make a conversation and communicate. And so essentially, like any other muscle in your body, if you don't use it, you lose it. So we want to try to make sure that we're getting that social interaction regularly, not just for our mood, et cetera, but again, for our memory and how our brain processes things. People who tend to be more social and interactive, again, tend to have fewer problems with cognitive decline or memory issues, expressive language difficulties, etc. Mental stimulation, just again, like any other muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. So I'm not sure how many of you make time in your day intentionally to think about things you're doing to keep your brain active and strong. I think the biggest things that people kind of overlook are the simple things. We don't always have to do things that are very complicated to get benefit for our brain. So I always use the example of we teach children to read out loud for a reason, right? Very young children can learn to read, often by reading out loud, because again, they're mimicking us, we're showing them pronunciation, etc. They also create a stronger connection as they're learning to do that between their memory and their expressive language skills. But I don't know how many of you read out loud to yourselves these days. It's probably something we overlook. But even reading out loud for 10 minutes a day can have benefit because in that time you're using 50% more of your brain than you are when you're reading to yourself. Doing things like crosswords, word searches, those things force you to create words and phrases out of letters. Seems simplistic. I have a lot of people who come to me and say, my spelling has really gone down. Why is that? Well, maybe it's something that is changing in your brain. But also, how can we start to use that muscle again? It doesn't have to be the New York Times Sunday crosswords, guys, because I don't like that one either. Makes me a little frustrated. It's a little difficult for me, but I can sure do my kids' third grade ones just fine. So I definitely take copies of hers and use them for myself sometimes. But they're so nice because you can put them down when you want to. It's not something where you have to exhaust your brain. A frustrated brain will never work as well as a brain that's having some fun. So cognitive stimulation is important. How we do it can be in a variety of ways. You guys probably have some music programs here sometimes, I would assume. Music is wonderful for your brain. We say get at least 60 minutes of music a day. Listen to 60 minutes of music. Again, just like I was saying before, our brain is interconnected. We make memories and store music in a different place in our brain because it has that emotional connection for most of us. And I don't care if you're listening to Mozart or Stills and Nash or whatever you like. It's just as long as you're enjoying it. That does help, again, with those neurotransmitters and having some dopamine release, etc. So it's a good thing. So aging in our brain. We'll just cut to the chase here, right? So there's multiple changes and factors that lead to our brain changing as we age. One of the big ones I think a lot of us hear about is neuron loss. Really, as we age, there's a reduced number of neurons, and therefore there aren't as many connections within the brain. And so that can lead to decreased communication between those brain regions that we looked at before. That means that processes can slow down. Things aren't getting to where they need to be as quickly or effectively as they did before. We also have to think about that vasculature system. So these are the blood vessels in our body. Our blood vessels age, right? And unfortunately, as they age, they don't maintain their elasticity. This is why many of us have difficulties with blood pressure control as we age as well, because those vessels don't expand and contract like they used to. Over time, that can lead to rising blood pressure. Rising blood pressure can also create micro damage, even in the small vessels of our brain. And as you can imagine, our vessels take blood to everywhere in our body, and it delivers oxygen and nutrients. So if those blood vessels aren't working like they should, then we're not getting those nutrients and we're not getting that oxygen to where it needs to go as effectively. Chemical changes, again, coming back to those neurotransmitters, we don't make as many of those as we age. Again, much like collagen and biotin and other things in our body, we don't make as well as we age. These also tend to decline. So again, this will also be important a little later when we're talking about nutrition. Again, if we don't have the neurotransmitters that we need in our body, it's going to impact our mood and our cognitive flexibility. And then, of course, as neurons are lost, fluid replaces that. So we have an overall volume loss to our brain. So again, what's the ramifications here? Kind of like what else does our brain look like as it's aging? The estimated rate of atrophy is about 5% per decade. And that starts in our 40s, approximately. But the rate can increase usually after the age of 70. There's some variability with these stats in the literature. And brain changes aren't uniform. They don't happen in the same way in every brain or in every area of the brain. So again, due to cognitive atrophy, the most common change that we see is in memory. So again, in that frontal lobe, which is the center for decision-making, memory, and emotional control. And then the hippocampus, which is actually a deep to the temporal side of our brains. It's kind of hidden in the brain and protected. That affects learning and memory. So again, when we're having difficulties learning how to use the new remote or that silly new iPhone that we got, that's where we're starting to have some problems, right? As we age, the brain tries to help, so it's not all bad, I promise. The brain tries to help by increasing how much, kind of where they're trying to get neuron activity from. So usually our brain does processes in one side or another. But as we age, we see from scans and research that our brain starts to work more on both sides. So again, it's trying to help us out. Again, those variables like hormones, genetics, neurotransmitters, and even our own culture and experiences can play a role in how our brain changes as an individual, which is why we'll never know everything about the brain, right? Biological brain age may not be the same as chronological brain age. So this is where it gets pretty interesting. And that addressing some of those determinants of brain health we talked about before has been shown in some studies to help slow brain aging, especially if it's started early and maintained across a lifespan. So we're talking routine here, right? There's no magic wand, unfortunately, but if you find one, let me know. I think the other piece is like creating routines is so important for all of us across our life. So the idea is creating routines with these good healthy behaviors as well. As we age, so this is kind of like the why do we care, right? As we age, we have a higher risk for developing neurological disorders. It's estimated that the number of people age 60 and older will be 2 billion by the year 2050. So therefore, if our rate of neurological disorders is going to be higher as we age, we know that we're going to see more and more neurological disorders over time. So globally, neurological disorders were the second leading cause of death in 2016. But more interestingly, it was the leading cause of disability in 2016. So not necessarily death, but where we need more resources and we need more medical care because of those conditions. So coming down to brass tacks is stroke, migraine, Alzheimer's disease, other dementias, and meningitis are the largest contributors to those neurological disabilities, and they end up requiring higher level of care needs and therefore resources. So kind of coming down to neurological disorders. So this is something that gets a little muddy for folks. Neurological disorders kind of encompasses many things, but essentially we're breaking it down into 3 areas. Number one is it's brain diseases that cause structural damage to the brain, and brain disorders that cause functional change and damage to the brain, and then the brain disorders that don't necessarily cause detectable structural or functional impairment, but still end up leading to debility in many people. So the brain diseases that cause structural damage are those things like, head injuries. You got those concussions, you fell and whacked your head, had a little subdural hematoma. Things like infections, meningitis, yes, indeed, COVID-19 is included in this. And of course, communication and sensory disorders. And then functional change, or disorders that go along with functional change, are those things that we talk about a lot in dementia. So again, Alzheimer's, frontal temporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, and Parkinson's. And then, of course, mental disorders falls into this category as well, too. So things like schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, alcoholism, and drug abuse also fit into that category because it does cause functional change to the brain cells. And then, of course, the disorders that don't really fit into either of those categories are things like migraines and sleep disorders. So again, still important, even though they're not necessarily causing those structural or functional changes. So kind of coming into dementia, a note on dementia. So dementia is a word that I think, utilize in culture a lot. It's kind of like glitter. People use it a lot. They spread it all around, but it's kind of annoying. It's hard to clean up after. But the idea is that dementia often is used as a term that's incorrectly used. So I kind of wanted to make sure I get that out here today because it's one of the biggest things I have to talk about in my clinic with folks. So dementia is actually, all it means is it's an umbrella term. It's a very vague, generalized term that is memory and thinking changes that are occurring and are more than due to age alone. And you need some help doing functional day-to-day things. Now, I'm not talking about functional day-to-day things that, like you have to get dressed. I mean, that could be included. But that could be like, I need help when I'm doing my taxes because I just can't do it the way I used to. That's a very high-level function of your brain. To be able to do your taxes, give me your number because I can't. But if you can, right, that is something that if that's a change for you, well, that is a functional change that could be related to memory. And would, again, potentially qualify a dementia change. But again, not everybody with any memory change has dementia, but I think people often think about that. Currently, there are roughly 50 million people worldwide living with dementia. So this will increase to 2050, again, that's that magical 2050 again. It will almost triple to 152 million people. So I don't know about you, but we were just talking about the resources and the extra needs for those things. So it kind of feels like a tsunami coming at me. and that it feels like there's going to be a lot of need, and how do we meet that need, right? About 40% of people in their 8th decade of life would meet criteria, if we're using this criteria, for dementia. I think that surprises a lot of folks. Because again, this is such a basic term, and so that's what I'm trying to get across, is that this is just an umbrella term. So again, it encompasses many different disorders, and remember, it is mainly speaking to function. So that's the part that I like to point out, is that you need help day to day with certain functions that you didn't need help with before because of a cognitive change. Dementia is not. Alzheimer's is not synonymous with dementia. So I can reassure everyone that that is not necessarily the case. Dementia is not only a neurodegenerative disorder, it can also come from other places, like vascular causes or due to an infection, like we talked about before. There's usually more than one condition leading to a dementia diagnosis. It's very rare that I see people that simply have pure Alzheimer's, and that is the only reason they have dementia. It's generally estimated that over 40% of dementia cases are due to a mixed cause. So something like having a vascular disease and Alzheimer's, or Lewy body and Alzheimer's, for example. So again, this isn't always as clean cut as I think some people feel, or like the media has made us believe in the past. So again, I like this pie graph through Alzheimer's. So it's the Alzheimer's Association through United Kingdom. But essentially it's showing us, right, that we can break down the occurrences of things like Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, mixed dementia, other Parkinson's, all these reasons people can have dementia. But again, when we're cutting up the pie, how much of that is truly this mixed type? A lot of these disorders, of course, are progressive disorders. So they're things that we watch over time. So things don't always herald themselves the first time you see somebody for memory changes. So it's always good to keep these things on our radar because, again, if someone's starting to now have movement changes where their memory changes were the biggest issue before, well, now we might have more than one disorder going on as well. So addressing memory changes. So there's multiple facets to cognitive change. As we've already learned, there's so many processes that go into that, and so many of them are unique to the individual as well. And we can't necessarily, cover all of those, we can't make all of those things kind of go away, or we can't stratify for all of those risks. But memory changes do not necessarily mean you have dementia, so I like people to be aware of that. Memory changes also do not necessarily equate to incapacity. I think a lot of times people don't want to come see someone like me in a clinic because they're like, well, if they tell me I have memory changes, I'm not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z, or they'll tell me I shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z, or they'll tell me I can't make my own decisions. And I like to tell people that's not actually the case, because more and more we can see people in various stages of memory change. Which is why I put this down here. So the stages of memory change can be subjective cognitive changes, which might be normal aging changes. You might walk into a room and forget why you're there, right? Maybe I put my keys on the counter and I never put them there and I forgot that's where they were. Maybe I went out to the grocery store and then couldn't remember what the next place I was going to go to was, right? Those are multiple step types of things that can be harder to remember over time, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have a neurodegenerative disorder. Mild cognitive impairment is, again, I tell people this is more of a kind of a prelude sometimes to dementia, but not everyone who has mild cognitive impairment will have dementia. So what I tell people is, here's the difference. Mild cognitive impairment is memory and thinking changes due to more than age alone. That sounds familiar, right? So the only difference between mild cognitive impairment and dementia is that functional piece, is that you do not necessarily have any issues with your day-to-day functions when you have mild cognitive impairment, but you can still have memory changes. Now, will everyone progress to dementia? Is this a linear track? No, it's not. Once you're in a stage of dementia, again, our function has declined and it's not something that is reversible. You could be in mild, moderate, or severe stages of dementia. Again, this is also dependent on function. So these are the places that the pieces we were talking about before, like I have a hard time doing my taxes versus I can't pick out what I want to wear today because I can't make a connection between the weather and what's safe to wear, right? Those are very different functions. So we utilize those things to help us tell people where they're at in a process, if that's what's happening. So function still remains very important. People do not go through stages of change in a uniform way, and again, they don't go through it in a linear way. So again, that's because these things are impacted by so much. And they might be things we can control, and they may be things that we have no control over at this point. There are often reversible causes to memory change, and that's probably the number one reason I tell people to get checked out. If you have concerns, see somebody, talk to them. Because I can tell you right now, probably about 40% of the people I see in my clinic is I can make some changes here in these areas, and their memory actually feels better, and they perform better over time. So medications, I would say, is probably the number one thing that end up being something that contributes to memory changes or cognitive decline. Polypharmacy, that's just a fun word to say, but polypharmacy is really using a lot of medications that can have similar side effects and might negatively be impacting other areas of your health, even if they're helping with a different condition. Sometimes it's, hey, can we put you on a medication that does the same job but maybe has fewer side effects, right? Sometimes that's limited by insurance. Sometimes we can't do anything about that, but it pays to have the conversation. Metabolic causes, this one I love. So vitamin deficiencies. I don't know if any of you in here, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Has anyone ever had their vitamin B6 checked? Yeah. Almost nobody in primary care checks a vitamin B6, but it's still a really important B vitamin for making things like neurotransmitters, which we just talked about were so important. So if you're not having enough vitamin B6, for example, and you're not making enough acetylcholine, your memory is going to decline. So if we can help boost those things for you and give your brain the best benefit, I'm going to make those kinds of recommendations first and see if that helps. So B vitamins are very important. So it's not just the classic B12, it's your B6, B1, B9, vitamin D. Checking things like your thyroid level as well. Those things can be important. Mood. Mood is something that, again, can be difficult. Anxiety, depression. If they're not well managed, or maybe you're going through a hard time or a crisis, a loss, depression, those things are definitely going to stress your brain. And as we said before, a brain that's stressed out is never going to work as well as a brain that's having fun or is content and happy. So addressing anxiety and depression, whether that's with a mental health provider, your primary care provider, or taking a medication, there's many tools that we can use to help address anxiety, depression, and mental health. So again, I think that those things, sometimes we can feel like there's barriers because of weights and things like that, but very important to get addressed. Sleep, sleep hygiene and sleep apnea. So when I first meet somebody in memory clinic, I talk about a lot of these things, and we try to do assessments as where we can optimize things. I would say probably about 30% of people who come into me have symptoms or are at higher risk for sleep apnea, and they don't even know it. I think most of the time we think about people who suffer with sleep apnea as being overweight and generally males, but that's not the case. The thing with sleep apnea is that some of my clients sleep alone. They don't know if they snore. They don't know if they're waking up gasping for air. They can't tell me necessarily if they're having an apnea period where they're having, disordered breathing at night because they don't notice it, right? But they might tell me that they're waking up tired every day. They might tell me they have to get up at night a lot to go to the bathroom, right? That can come from a lot of places. But one place people don't think about is having sleep apnea. And sleep hygiene, of course, I'm guilty of it too. I certainly look at my phone in bed sometimes. I know, it's not good, but it's something that we can change, something we can do something about, right? We know from multiple studies globally that screen use is impacting sleep negatively. So I always tell people, if you can limit your screen use, especially for like an hour before bed, try to shut all the screens off if you can. I mean, so many of us watch the evening news and then go right to bed, right? But it's having those blue and green lights can actually inhibit how our brain tells itself to go to sleep and to get ready for sleep. So giving yourself time to potentially settle down, be relaxed before bed can help with sleep. I do tell people, if you tend to have a hard time getting to sleep, try to go to lay down, then get back up after about 30 minutes if you're not sleeping. do something that's not TV, like fold some laundry or read a book, and then try to reinitiate sleep. Sometimes that helps. And then, of course, hearing and vision changes. So regular vision and hearing exams, I know, again, your primary care provider probably talks to you about this too. Generally over the age of 65, of course, I tell people you want to be having your eyes checked and your hearing checked. We just talked about how the brain is really responsible for sensory input and output. And so if we don't have corrected vision, if we have hearing loss that's not corrected, we're not going to remember things or recall them correctly. We can't even remember them correctly and encode them correctly to recall them correctly later. And as one of my colleagues so eloquently says, you don't remember 100% of the things you don't hear. You also don't know 100% of the things you don't hear until you have your hearing checked. So usually I tell people, if you haven't had it done, talk to your PCP about it, or even going to places like Costco or Sam's Club, have audiologists that can check your hearing to see if you have deficits. And of course, recent surgery and anesthesia. I never want to base someone's memory and cognition off of a moment that I meet them if they just went through something like surgery, anesthesia, or recovering, because their body's still healing and there could be evolution in those symptoms where they could actually get better over time. So what is normal changes? Good question. That's changing all the time. So some cognitive changes are considered normal, like we talked about. However, as we are going through culture, we're living longer, right? And that's going to impact what we learn about our brain as being normal. So I think we're going to hear more and more about what's considered normal as we age in the future, as well as studies are ongoing. But it's kind of cool to think about. Like I said, that statistic before, where 40% of people in their 8th decade of life could probably be considered, positive or meet criteria for dementia. But how is that going to be changing when we're studying centurions? And more people who are living to be 100 or plus. So it's good to know kind of what their secrets are and how they're doing it. So again, assessment is important and it's multifaceted. So in order to know if your changes are normal, sometimes we actually have to do a little bit more digging. It's not something you can necessarily just answer, even sometimes in a primary care's office. So we're all individuals. Knowing what's normal for a person requires knowing what's changed from a baseline, right? So having collateral information can also help. I often ask people to bring somebody to clinic with them, because if you've known someone for a long time and you can give me feedback on how things are changing for that person, that's going to go a long way into what recommendations I'm going to make. Now again, it's okay to always disagree. We can agree to disagree sometimes, that's fine. But it's still, you definitely have those people who are like, I don't think I do that. And someone will say, nope, I've definitely noticed a change. And that's okay, but the idea is we have, that other piece to the puzzle. Again, if there are changes, do they get better if we address reversible or modifiable factors, or if we get people started on some of those 6 pillar activities? So again, those 6 areas that we tell people we want you to work on, if we have you work on those, do things get better, right? Generally, something that's neurodegenerative is going to get worse over time. It's going to be progressive. We're not going to be able to suddenly get better, right? And then of course, there a family history of cognitive change, and what did it look like? So, up until way in the past, about 9-10 years ago, sorry, that's not way in the past, but we didn't necessarily, all of these diagnoses were generally clinical based, meaning that we looked at the symptoms, we looked to see if it was progressing, and we could make a diagnosis off of that, because we didn't really have a whole lot of other tools to use to go off of, not clinically anyway. So when someone comes in and says, oh, my mom had Alzheimer's, I'll say, oh, okay, well, what did it look like, right? Because maybe it wasn't Alzheimer's, it was just what she was diagnosed with. Unless someone had an autopsy where they actually had a brain biopsy, sometimes we might never know what someone actually had as a diagnosis. Until now, which I'll talk about later. But knowing if memory changes are typical as early as, are atypical as early as possible can actually help ensure we're preserving memory for as long as possible and slowing progression, right? Which leads to less functional change. That's what you guys are seeing day to day, right? I'm gonna look at how I function and what my quality of life is. If my cognition is making my quality of life change, or I'm noticing I can't do things as well as I used to, that's probably gonna make me feel like my quality of life is lower. So as early as we can detect changes, we want to start preventing further change, or at least slowing it down, because most of these disorders don't necessarily have a cure, right? I always say cure in quotes, because there's usually more to it than that. But again, establishing if there's a memory problem is the first step. It can take multiple assessments to get to that point. So I always tell people, again, knowing what's normal is usually a little bit more involved than people think it is, as opposed to, your blood pressure. You can go in and have your blood pressure checked 3 times. If it's always elevated, they'll tell you have hypertension. Again, this is a little bit more nuanced. The next step, of course, is finding out what the cause of memory changes, if they persist or worsen over time, are. And I always put in parentheses, if you want to know, right? I never want to force these things on people. I want people to want the information I'm giving them, because I recognize that sometimes this information can change how people are living, what their plans are, what their relationships are like with their family and friends, how they see themselves. There's a lot of implications here, because remember, our brain processes all of those social inputs, all of our emotions and our emotional regulation, as well as telling all of our limbs what to do and what our heart should do, etc. So the brain is still a mystery, but we have more tools to assess memory changes now than ever before. And we're going to continue to expand that. So far, we do not have anything that's more accurate than a brain biopsy, like I talked about before. But if anyone ever offers you one of those, don't take them up on it. It's not what we're doing right now. So we're going to try to get as close as we can get without a brain biopsy in order to get the best picture of what might be happening. So cognitive screening testing, these are paper and pencil tests. They don't require any, fancy iPad or iPhone or laser pointer, nothing like that. That we can often do in offices that at least give us some kind of a jumping off point, right? Again, they're not perfect. They don't control for age, gender, education level, but it is something that can get us started. Full neuropsychological testing or neurocognitive testing can clarify areas of deficit more accurately. Those tests are more accurate because we're going to test you for longer, meaning that we're going to get a better picture of things like attention, concentration, and processing over a longer period of time, rather than a cognitive screening test, which is about 15 minutes. But also it does take out those biases, and so it factors in age, gender, and education level. So again, it will be a little bit more accurate. Of course, it does take longer. It's about an hour of testing, sometimes a little more. But it generally, again, tends to be more individualized. And then, of course, we have brain images. So we use CT scans, MRI scans, metabolic PET scans, and amyloid PET scans in order to help get a better picture of what's happening in your brain. CT scans and MRI scans generally do best by looking at the vasculature and the structure of your brain. Something like a metabolic PET scan, however, looks at the function of your brain, because it looks at how your brain uses sugar. Yes, sugar indeed is one of the major fuels for our brain. So all of us on those low carbohydrate diets might not be doing the best thing for our brain anyway. So bread is okay sometimes, is the moral of my story. So, yeah. And then, of course, amyloid PET scans, which, again, we really have been using clinically for maybe the last 3 to 5 years or so. Those are scans that are specific for amyloid deposition in the brain, which, again, can help us be a little bit more accurate when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease specifically. And, again, while we talked about some other neurodegenerative disorders like, Lewy body and frontal temporal, we don't have scans that are so specific for them yet, but I'm hoping in the future we will with the research that's been happening. So. And then, of course, we have CSF fluid and blood-based biomarker testing. Those are CSF fluid we've been using much longer. It's a little less accurate than the newer blood-based biomarkers. Blood-based biomarkers are getting a lot of, attention recently, of course. So I get a lot of questions about them. Again, they are a really great tool utilized in the right scenario. They can give us good information. Sometimes they don't give us much information. And of course, there's still potentially some costs related to some of these newer technologies because insurance doesn't always cover them uniformly, unfortunately, yet. I think they will in the future because they'll have to, because we're using them so often. And of course, more are being developed all the time. There's a lot of research and study that's going into that right now. So again, we use all of these pieces to make the most accurate picture, right? So it's like a puzzle coming together to get the clearest picture. It's a glimmer of what we can do, right? Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
So
And I'm happy to expand on those things if we have some time too. Yeah, exactly. So now what? The moral is don't wait, right? There's things we can do. We can help. I think unfortunately people don't come to see providers because they're afraid we're gonna say, oh, there's nothing we can do. There's no cures for these things, right? But I do tell people we can try to optimize your brain health. We can try to help it work better and make you feel better. So again, we don't have things that cure frontal temporal dementia, Alzheimer's, Lewy body, but I do still think that working to prevent them is a goal of best medicine, and also giving you guys the information and education about what you can do for yourselves at home even before you see somebody, right? So obviously we'd want everyone to start these things before memory changes start, but I always also tell people it's not necessarily too late to start even when we're in our 50s, right? Maybe you've never been an exerciser. Maybe, it took you a while to start to eat healthy, but those things are still beneficial even now. And again, we can't control injuries, we can't control accidents, we can't control if you fall sometimes, and those things might lead to changes later with memory. But if we do those things, as far as lifestyle management, like we talked about, right? Physical activity, eating healthy, getting good sleep, we can recover better. We can have a stronger brain later. And of course, even if you have a predisposition genetically, because some of us do come into the world with family histories of these things, these memory loss disorders, is that you can actually help lower your risk of it if you're doing some of these lifestyle modifications. So we work to control what we can as early as possible and try to make it a routine, like we talked about before. Routine's important. So if we can create routines, it's going to benefit us over time. So that's, again, why all of our primary care providers are telling us exercise, eat healthy, get good sleep. And that also it's going to help our brain later in life as well, too. That's a great question. So for people who might not have heard in the back, the question is, over-the-counter supplements, brain boosters, Prevagen, Nariva, right? We've all heard of those, and they can cost a lot of money over the counter. They don't necessarily improve things. There is some benefit for things like ginkgo biloba, and again, some of those B vitamins we talked about before are actually probably going to do you better than things like Prevagen. Some of those things don't even cross the blood-brain barrier, so they're not even getting to the area that you need them to help you with. So paying for them isn't going to do us any good. I'd rather you spend that money on going out with a friend or buying yourself some good crossword puzzle books. That's where you're going to find more benefit. That's a great question. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? That's a good one, yeah. Yes, so physical activity not only helps, as we age, yes, we're going to have decreased ability for our blood vessels to be, again, kind of elastic. But if we're exercising, our blood vessels are going to be healthier, and you are actually going to help prevent vessel damage over time. And so you are helping yourself. Even if you started, again, today, right, you're still going to be benefiting because you're going to move that blood through the brain better, more effectively, right? So you're going to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the brain better when you're exercising. So yes, that can help. It may not help damage that's already done. So yeah, what's your question? So meditation really, I think, has more of its benefit, most likely in some of those pieces of like stress control, being able to utilize them for anxiety. I think maintaining, I also think of like Tai Chi too, because that's wonderful for balance and things like that. But I think when it comes down to meditation, there's a lot of pieces between meditation that actually connect the brain and the heart and your cardiovascular system, right? If you meditate, you can actually get a lot of benefit when it comes down to the cardiovascular health in your body because you have that brain and body connection. I'm not very good at meditating. I think it is a practice. I think, the more we do it, the better we can have control over those pieces. I know a lot of people who can lower their blood pressure by meditating. Is that going to be a benefit? Yes, right? Because you're going to be getting benefit for your vascular health. So I do think it's helpful if you can do it well. Yes. So if we're getting up multiple times a night, that can interrupt that deep sleep. I was going to say, and people will tell me, I get back to sleep really easily, which is great because then it's interrupting you less. It's often when we try to get up and then we try to get back to sleep and then it takes an hour. We're not getting back to sleep. Maybe we have to get up again. But getting back to sleep easily is a great thing. But it can still mean that maybe the bladder symptoms aren't necessarily just coming from your bladder. It could be your brain waking up and then your bladder saying, hey, let's go to the bathroom. So I tell people it's good to talk to your primary care provider about that because it could be multiple things. And some people are taking medications for their bladder that maybe is causing dry mouth and other symptoms that maybe you don't actually need. So I've seen that happen too, where people have been able to come off of medications because they had their sleep evaluated, which has been interesting. So lifelong learning, absolutely, whatever form it comes in, whether it's learning a new instrument, learning to cook something new. I have lots of people taking, cooking classes, doing things they've never tried before, painting classes. There's lots of programs out there too, like Play-Doh and the SAIL program. Those things are resources to help hook people up with lifelong learning opportunities. Or again, places like your community center, which has ongoing learning opportunities as well. Those are wonderful, and I encourage people to do them as much as they can. I know sometimes there's barriers like having to get transportation or whatnot, but if those are things that you can do, yes, you're going to get benefit from them. So the question is, can I get blood work covered, essentially, like for these vitamins, right? So I usually tell people, yes, insurance is still going to want a reason why you're having them drawn, right? But you can very simply say to your, provider is like, hey, I've just been noticing some cognitive changes, and I just want to make sure I don't have any deficiencies. And that's usually sufficient to make sure that that's covered through CMS. So some people will use supplements like a B complex, right? Now, again, supplements over the counter can be tricky because they're all different, and each manufacturer has a different amount of each B vitamin in it. So what I tell people is that it's probably best to actually get your vitamins checked to know if you need it or not, right? And also, depending on what's low and what's high, people can, like providers, I myself can make recommendations on, let's give you this B vitamin, or let's do this complex, because that's going to cover all of them, or it's going to be too much for you, right? Because I also recognize those things cost a lot of money too, and I would want you to invest in what's going to be helpful. So,
how do you say that?
Ginkgo biloba, yeah.
Yeah, that's good for you as well.
Some people have gotten some, there are some limited studies that show some benefit, but is it something that's necessary? Not always.
Okay.
And also, if you're on other medications, you want to be careful about supplements. So some supplements negatively interact with things like blood pressure medications or cholesterol medications. I know people are afraid to get evaluated sometimes. That's a barrier. But I tell people, be seen, because we can do those simple cognitive screenings right there in the office. So it's something that you can do pretty easily, mainly because, again, unless you know, sometimes we might not be motivated to make changes, right? Or know where we need to make changes. Also, if you are having changes in your brain and someone recognizes them, like your primary care provider, they might be able to even tell you right there, this medication could cause a problem. This medication could cause a problem, right? So I think that can be helpful to give you a direction. So I really think that those are beneficial. So if you're exercising, you're eating well, you're making sure that you're trying to do those cognitive activities, right? Reading, crossword puzzles, staying social. Those are things they're going to ask you about as well as part of that circumstance. Because even if those things don't change anything, you're doing good things for your brain. But there might be something more happening, right? So, good question. So the UW actually takes self-referrals. I know not every clinic is like that, so, but our memory clinic, you can actually refer yourself. Yeah. Good question. So most of the time for the initial visit, if you have symptoms of memory change, insurance usually would cover that. Yes. Now, any further testing would need a reason, right? So if we did this memory screening tool and everything was normal, well, we might not be able to do things like blood or whatnot. But again, it's a good jumping off point. So, because you can really focus on memory, right? When you go to your primary care provider's office, maybe you're focusing on multiple things, and it's hard to really narrow down on that based on time frame or whatnot. But yeah. Thank you for your attention and your questions.
How about we give her another big hand? I think there was a lot of information. Now let's see how much of that we can remember, right? Right?